What nasty side effects did you experience in clinical trials? Phase 1 clinical trial for skin cream designed for emergency burn care. Half the participants, myself not included, started sloughing off sheets of skin like lepers. For the ones affected, their bed sheets or pajamas would pull away the top layer of their arm or leg. We only had one limb treated per dosage. It was pretty gruesome and the trial was cancelled after just a week. I spent a while worrying about it happening, then I assumed I was in the control group. Turns out, I wasn't in the control group, but what the cream was doing was making the skin ultra-sensitive to sunlight. Since I worked indoors and had just discovered Team Fortress 2, I didn't get enough sunlight to trigger the side effect. Gaming saves lives, people. CalGB 10801. Did a number on my liver, but I don't have leukemia now, so I'll take it. I didn't get paid, but I got to live through for what many is a terminal diagnosis, so I figured that was payment enough. I took part in a trial of a malaria vaccine. The vaccine didn't have any side effects, but I did have to sit with a cup of mosquitoes on my arm biting me. Also, I got malaria. I got paid £2,500, and I was well aware of the risks going in and not only motivated by money. Malaria is a huge deal globally, and I wanted to help fight towards its eradication. I'm not a good enough person to say I'd have done it for free, but I also wouldn't have done it if the money was the only reward. The money and the global need added up, if that makes sense, and it was a really interesting process to be a part of. As a scientist in a field pretty far removed from medicine, physics by the way, malaria is still a huge killer, but there's a much better way to help with the issue than the one I went for while at university: give to an effective charity. In fact, in terms of lives saved per dollar donated, giving to the AMF is about the best thing you can possibly do with your money. I've done far more good in the last few years by donating to them than I did by taking part in the trial. It's less interesting and far less cool, but it doesn't come with malaria. Malaria freaking sucks, but it's completely curable. I was blood tested every day after exposure, and as soon as they found signs of the parasite in my blood, they pumped me full of treatment, some synthetic quinine or something similar, according to the docs. The malaria I got was a lab strain with no resistance to the treatment, and it took about 5 days for me to feel better. Those 5 days were absolutely awful. I'm guessing that a lot of you believe that malaria stays with you for life, and there's some truth to that. Some types of malaria, the less deadly kinds as it happens, can appear to be treated. The person gets better, no parasites in the blood, but then they return much later. I got a type where this doesn't happen, but does tend to kill people with no resistance. Plasmodium falciparum. I would probably get malaria for 5 days for £2,500 to be honest. Plus, that's the ultimate sick day excuse. Just leave out the part where you got voluntarily injected. When I was in grad school, I volunteered to be in an experiment in the dental school. I needed to get a wisdom tooth out, and the deal was that they would test out a new filling material, and at the end, they got to keep the tooth, and I would get $300 and free dental work. After the first week, it started to hurt. After the second week, the dentists were saying to take more than a double dose of ibuprofen, and keep taking more unless my ears started ringing. By the time 3 weeks were up, there were moments where I had to sit down from the pain. 6 months after they removed the tooth, I was back in for a checkup. I asked the dentist if the experiment was a failure, and she sort of smiled and said that it was going into wider clinical trials. That's when I realized that I had been a part of the control group, valiantly proving that cavities hurt. To be fair to the researchers, they can't tell you that you're in the placebo group because your perception of pain knowing that you had a placebo would skew their data. To be fair to you, I certainly hope that they outlined the risks and procedures in the informed consent, because otherwise not informing you that there may be pain involved is a serious breach of research ethics, and is a valid complaint to the IRB. Oh, don't worry, it was all done correctly, I was informed. I, like most test subjects, imagined that I got the experimental treatment and worried about the side effects, when the opposite was in fact true in this case. One of my friends went in for a research study. He got paid $4,500 to try out a new med for an issue he was having. I think it was an insomnia treatment, I'll have to ask him. Anyways, now he sweats 100% of the time and has to drink over a gallon of water a day to remain reasonably hydrated. Not worth it in my opinion. Hyperhidrosis, poor guy. Not quite a clinical trial, but in the mid-80s my father was one of the first people to accept a new hay fever vaccine. He had suffered badly year on year. A few weeks later, he started losing weight, feeling fatigued, and just generally being ill. He was admitted to hospital, and after what he describes as hundreds of medical tests, failed to find any reason for why he was ill, The best they could come up with is that somehow a heterosexual man who had never used substances or had a blood transfusion had somehow developed the big transmissible disease of the 90s. Remember, this is back when it was still being called GRID. It was just assumed he'd get sicker and sicker until he passed away. But one day, he started to get better, which also stumped people researching that disease, because that hadn't happened to anyone else. The eventual conclusion being that they didn't know what it was, but it can't have been that. Doctors basically told him he seemed fine now and just to get on with his life. He went back to get the vaccine again the next year, but was told that it had been withdrawn after loads of people died after having it. Turns out it was just a massive dose of roids. It trashed the immune system and people couldn't fight off common illnesses. Hard to prove in retrospect, but it's assumed he came close to joining the deceased. I was in a trial for a treatment for IBD, Crohn's disease. The drug was modulating interleukin-11, basically trying to calm down your immune system so that it quits attacking your gut. It worked really well. I was in remission and I felt fantastic. Then I had my routine blood work done. You know that step where the tube is full of blood and the nurse shakes it back and forth a bit? When the nurse did that with mine, all the color drained from her face. She told me to stay where I was and sit very still, please. And she took off. Turns out that interleukin-11 is really good at making blood clot. When the nurse shook the tube of blood, it started clotting. That's not supposed to happen. Turns out my fibrinogen was so high that if I'd bumped my arm against the doorframe on my way out, I would have thrown a clot that would have killed me. A few doses of blood thinner later, and I was good as new. The trial was stopped, I wasn't the only one who clotted up, and the research was shelved. I've never found a medication that was as effective for treating my Crohn's, though. This one scares me the most. It scares me more than the ones where people have died, because you could have been killed at any point and just not known how it happened. Not a failed trial necessarily, since all the data was important, but my father-in-law was a conscientious objector for religious reasons during Vietnam. The army assigned him to be an insect repellent tester. He'd spend his days in an enclosed room covered by different compounds to see how his mosquito companions would react. Some compounds worked better than others. I got a bit of a headache in my trial. They cancelled 2/3 of the study because some liver values were higher than they should have been. I still got paid out in full, living on the edge. I tested a bladder control med that worked pretty well but caused irregular heartbeats. It was nice to not have to run to the bathroom 20 times a day, but I do need my heart to work properly. Having your heart work properly is ideal for day-to-day life, it must be said. Not sure if any of our IBS sufferers would decide it was worth it in the end, but who knows? I was in a study that was testing how people infected with a certain immunodeficiency disease reacted to bedbug bites. I can't remember which disease, it wasn't either of the two big ones though. I was a part of the healthy control group. I went into a sterile lab, got nibbled on safely by bedbugs. They put a screen between my arm and the bugs so they wouldn't end up on me, and then recorded my skin's reactions for a week. Did this 4 times, I think. I was informed they didn't find anything significant after the study concluded. Must have been a tough paper to submit to journals. My chest swelled up until it looked like I'd bolted basketballs onto my ribcage. Then I started lactating. Like, a lot. Like, can't leave the house because my fun bags are geysers, constantly shooting out some mystery fluid and occasionally blood. Then came the vertigo and the constant tinnitus. After a few days of this, I advised the doctor the final side effect was going to be self-deletion if we didn't start weaning me off this crap. The intended use was to treat bipolar disorder. Obviously, my reaction to it was extreme. My parents own a research center. We've had a patient die before. The medication was in phase 3. Phase 1 being the most dangerous, and patients stay at the research center, all the way to phase 4, which is supposed to be the most safe. Every time a patient dies while they're in the research study, the pharmaceutical company must send out a safety letter, which is kept on site with all the names of patients who died and their believed cause of death. We don't know the exact cause of death since we're not able to obtain any information after, but it's safe to assume that it was the medication, as it had 4 patients total die. Not in our site, but around the world 4 total. Unfortunately, some patients don't even care what the side effects are and just care about the money they get paid. Some of those deaths may be because of misuse of the medication, but there's really no way to know if the patient took the medication in studies where the patient gets to take the medication home. Very new medication goes through phase 1 research after they're tested on animals, where even the diet is controlled and extremely strict. I work in clinical trials. Most of our volunteers are students. Even though there's a fairly lengthy consent process, you can tell most of the volunteers have paid no attention at all, except for the part about how much they get paid. Some of them couldn't even tell you what substance they're taking and tell me that they think they've had the placebo. There are no placebos in my studies. Chest cancer treatment. I've had 4 rounds of the typical hair falls out, makes you puke stage 4 chemo, then 4 rounds of Taxotere, a somewhat less debilitating chemo, plus the clinical trial substance Xeloda. The trial was approved for metastatic disease, which I didn't have. The Taxotere makes everything taste like soap. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with food. The Xeloda gives you killer diarrhea. I spent 12 weeks basically eating nothing. I called it the Procter & Gamble diet. I managed to choke down a chocolate milkshake once a day and had explosive diarrhea for hours after. I lost 50 pounds. Turns out the Xeloda had no effect on the cancer, but the Taxotere, the soapy one, worked fine. I'm 12 years out of treatment. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. This is my line of work, clinical trial data, and one thing to keep in mind is that an adverse event is anything that happens during the trial, whether it's related or not. A guy gets headaches sometimes? Great! Every headache during his time in the trial is recorded as an AE and evaluated. And you might think, hey, I don't usually have heartburn or whatever, but I did just now and it's probably the medication. But the doctor decides that, and if there's any question, there are other docs and a safety panel who'll review it. I was on male hormonal birth control for years through clinicaltrials.gov. It was a huge success with minimal side effects, and I wish I could get back on it. The medication worked and was safe, but ultimately it hasn't been brought to the market because most men can't stand to inject themselves with an inch-long needle every week. Side effects were increased energy, fat loss, and an increased libido. Not a failed trial, but I signed up for a medical study where they had to remove a lymph node from my body. They were paying $300, so I figured what's the worst that could happen, right? Well, they didn't tell me that the lymph node was going to be taken from my bikini line by a 50-year-old surgeon who had to rub iodine all over my hoo-ha. He sewed it up a little bit funny, so I still have a huge scar and the wound was right where my leg bends, so I walked funny for like 3 weeks. If anyone asked why I was limping, I had to tell them about my poor disfigured vajayjay, and it was terrible. 3 out of 10, still got $300. I took part in a clinical trial for NASA where they paid me to essentially sleep for a month in one room. I couldn't go outside, couldn't leave the room, could play on my phone and go on the computer, but that was about it. I ended up sleeping probably 16 to 18 hours a day out of boredom. The trial wasn't technically a failure, but afterwards I had trouble sleeping usual amounts of the time, as well as doing day-to-day tasks. I was paid $5 grand for the month. I'd say it was worth it. Is it weird that the narrator would do the one where he would get malaria, but not being locked alone in a room for a month? Maybe if I could edit videos and just get paid gangbusters from both income sources, but I'm still not sure it seems worth it. My mother-in-law participated in a large-scale trial of aspirin being tested as a cure-all for the elderly. The pharmaceutical company was trying to prove that everyone should take aspirin daily beyond a certain age to reduce blood clotting. Coincidentally, it's also a great way to sell a lot of aspirin. My parents-in-law were both part of the trial, and my mother-in-law had some medical issues that ended up involving internal bleeding. If she hadn't been on aspirin, she would have been okay. But due to the blood-thinning aspect of the aspirin, the problem escalated badly and she ended up vomiting blood all over her hospital room and nearly died. It's hard to describe the feelings of horror and helplessness watching her vomiting blood on the floor while nurses rush into the room from everywhere, telling you to stand back and take emergency action to try to stop her from dying. One of the nurses later told us that we were extremely lucky that she lived. A few weeks after her near-death experience, a group of people from the pharmaceutical company showed up unannounced at their house and ever so gently pressured them into signing a waiver, withdrawing from the trial and saying they wouldn't sue. Being nice, trusting elderly people, they signed it. We later found out that the whole large-scale trial had been canned that same day. Since they got her agreement to withdraw, it won't be recorded in any official report that the trial nearly killed her, just that she withdrew from it. The whole thing really stank in my opinion. I imagine that they wanted to keep their options open to run more trials in the future, so they didn't want her negative results hanging over them. I was in a clinical trial for an allergy medication. My allergies were terrible throughout the trial, so either I was in the control group or the medication was a failure. The worst part was that my allergies were awful. I couldn't take any other allergy medication and it was just not fun. I don't think I'd do it for a condition that I needed to be treated for because being in the control group means that you suffer. I did a clinical trial attempting to treat Crohn's with an antibiotic. It turned my number 2s, number 1s, and even my splooge bright yellow. I came to find out it was a dye they used in the placebo to make it match the real deal. I got preganinant, a trial for a non-hormonal birth control gel. First month, used it probably 3 or 4 times. Long-distance boyfriend, we only see each other on weekends, if that. Bam, I'm 11 weeks in. It's okay, it's unplanned. I thought about terminating, but we both wanted kids and we wanted to be together, so we decided to figure it out. We were both in graduate school, both graduating before the due date, so hopefully we'll be more financially secure when it gets here. The worst part was probably having to explain. I usually just say it was unplanned and people don't ask, but with my parents and close friends, I had to explain. I ended up just saying we were switching methods and things got messed up, which is the truth. I once attended a trial for some kind of antidepressant or anxiolytic. First they injected me with cholecystokinin to cause an anxiety attack and I had to evaluate the severity. It was supposed to be maximum, 10 out of 10, but it wasn't for me, 6 out of 10. It made me realize that I'd had anxiety attacks before. I was evaluated as a healthy person, but it turned out I wasn't and in denial about my mental health. I didn't get taken to the next stage of the trial. Did a study for something that was supposed to be comparable to a NuvaRing. I was told that they had no real reason to think it wouldn't prevent pregnancy. It was more of a study to see how it eased period symptoms. They did suggest that I continue to use regular protection just in case. I wasn't worried about it, I'm not very fertile anyway, and getting paid to use free birth control sounded cool. I had the worst, heaviest, painful periods I've seen since before I started taking other birth control. But it was really only bad for 2 days a month, so I could live with it. It was supposed to be a 12-month study, but they cancelled it after about 7 months. 5 girls out of maybe 50 or so had gotten pregnant. The lady at the center said they'd all been very obese, and they figured that had something to do with why it was ineffective, and that I, a thin person, shouldn't be worried. I didn't get pregnant, but the fact that my period symptoms were so awful makes me think it probably wasn't working for me, and the fact that I didn't get pegante was just random. Honestly though, I'd do it all over again if I had the chance and just use rubber protection like normal. I got 2 free pap smears and a total of about $400. After doing a Google search and finding out what a NuvaRing is, how to insert said ring, and many graphic and comprehensive pictures of both the installation of said protection and how it works, we'll call today's video an educational experience for the narrator. See, I'd consider it a fail. However, the medicine they used has gone on to the next phase in being approved by the FDA. I was part of a trial where they were testing an extended pain relief injection, a mixture of Marcaine and bupivacaine, for a recovery after surgery to try and limit the amount of narcotics needed for pain relief. I received a bunionectomy and stayed with the clinic for 3 days while they monitored me by taking blood at regular intervals as well as vitals. I had the option for rescue meds if I needed them. The nurses in the clinic destroyed my hands and arms from not being able to properly withdraw blood, and they weren't the nicest people. After being discharged, I developed a very large blister on the top of my foot that was operated on, and I rapidly declined from there. I ended up having a hole on the top of my foot the size of a $50, which exposed the metatarsal and a joint on my big toe, which in turn exposed me to a host of different types of infection. I lost my job because of being extremely sick and had to have over 8 surgeries, 3 of which I woke up during. I had a wound vacuum for around 8 months and had to be in a hyperbaric chamber, 3 to 4 times a week. I had antibiotic-resistant infections including a chronic bone infection and also became dependent on painkillers. I couldn't walk for over a year and was almost hospitalized a few times. At one point we were discussing possible amputation. I was severely depressed. I was one of 3 people who had this happen to them. I have permanent scars and deformations from what I went through. I'll never be the same again because of this. And none of what I experienced was listed in the informed consent that I signed. Was given Roaccutane back in the 90s when it was still being tried. Now they know that 2 out of every 100 teenagers successfully commits self-deletion, and I know why I've been living with a voice inside my head telling me to unalive myself ever since. I was in a trial where they were testing a new instrument to intubate people with. Somehow it got stuck in my throat and I was choking bad as the anesthesia kicked in and I lost consciousness. It's a very strange feeling to be choking as you lose consciousness into the darkness. I thought maybe I was dying. It was traumatic and my throat was very sore for a week after that. I know it was a trial and I signed up for it, but the whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. Seemed like amateur hour. Not as severe as the other people here, but I was in a study testing the benefits to asthma sufferers overall breathing from taking Allegra. It works okay on allergy symptoms, but didn't do squat for my lung capacity or the frequency of my asthma attacks. It was nice not to have the itchy eyes, though. Was in adult ADD trial to make Concerta being on adults with ADD. Every week dosage increased. Eventually dose went over 100 milligrams a day. I didn't sleep for what seemed like weeks and lost loads of weight. I really think they wanted to see how high they could take it. After a few weeks of that, I refused to be in the study if they raised it any more. My wife took part in a clinical trial for an HPV vaccine before I'd ever met her. The trial was unsuccessful in that the specific vaccine wasn't approved or successful, but it did provide the people developing the vaccine good data which helped them develop a vaccine, which did work. As far as I know, there was no adverse side effects. I was the reason it failed. It was a very well put together psychology experiment in decision making. Took hours just to be a part of. It was seeing if men or women would be higher risk takers. The people programmed video games, made long questionnaires, put together tons of work. We started as a group of 50 men and women, then split to 25 of each separately. Then 5 groups of 5. About 10 minutes into being in the 25-person group, I asked, "Wait, are we just supposed to avoid risks in this to get the better score?" We had been told it was the decision-making and not the risk-taking. Risk was the variable. When I called it out, we all tailored our choices differently. I was later banned from trials. My professor was kind of annoyed at me for that. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.